Hello everyone, good morning. I decided to do the follow-up video on 5 reasons not to move to Cochise County. This is the day after I shot the first video of 5 reasons why you should move to Cochise County. So if you haven't watched that one, I recommend that you do, especially if you're an off-gridder and you're looking for a place to relocate to build whatever you want. There's lots of great reasons to move to Cochise County, but there's also some downsides, and I want to be, fair and honest and balanced. So I've got 5, actually 7, probably more reasons why you shouldn't move to Cochise County. So without further ado, let's get into them. The first one is that if you're going to be building something, or if you're not, you just need repairs, because it's a collection of small towns in Cochise County. I happen to live near Bisbee. Good contractors are in very high demand, and they're busy and they're expensive. So if you need a good plumber, a good electrician, roofer, any of those types of things, an HVAC type of person, they can be difficult to find, and when you do find them, you're going to pay through the nose for their services. So while that isn't, the biggest reason in the world, I would never say, hey, don't move here because it's hard to find contractors. If your intention is to build a home and you're not going to DIY it, if you're actually going to farm it out to subcontractors and just oversee it, it might be a challenge and it might be more expensive than you think. So it's certainly at least worth mentioning. And that holds true in general. Labor around here is hard to come by because people either work remotely like me, or they maybe don't have the skills, or they're just looking for part-time work. So if you're a business owner and you're thinking about setting up a business, just be aware that you're either going to have to pay a really good hourly rate to attract people, or you're just going to have to do it all yourself because you might have trouble finding employees. So labor and contractors are hard to come by. So that's worth doing some research on if you're a business owner. Number 2, and I got to keep checking my notes. Okay, it has to do with politics. I tend to fall... even though I'm a very liberal, progressive person in general, I am blessed or cursed with being able to see both sides of most arguments, not all. So I can get along with most people because I can tend to see some merit in their political beliefs, unless they're just straight up racist, asshole, hateful people, in which case, no, we're probably not going to find any common ground. But Cochise County is ruby red. In fact, in this last election cycle, it's made national news because the people who oversee our election counting wanted to refuse to certify results. They're all up in arms about remote or mail-in voting, early voting, essentially. And that's still going on. So there's big political turmoil in Cochise County. Now, that doesn't have to impact you if you're not a political type, but just be aware that, the country, the United States, is somewhat polarized politically, and Cochise County is no exception. So if you want to be a place that is extremely conservative overall, Cochise County is the place for you. It is a diehard Trump country. Now, does everyone run around talking about it in public when they're going about their business? Not really, and because it's a small town, people aren't congregating in large numbers and discussing things like politics. There's not really any congregation at all, except if there's a parade or, at a bar, but people are listening to music and having fun and dancing at a bar. They're not talking politics. And if they do, someone will probably tell them to take it outside. So it's not like you run into people, but you'll definitely see Trump flags. You don't see any Biden flags because progressives don't tend to worship Joe Biden. So it's something to be aware of. And that's not to say there aren't pockets of progressives. In fact, the neighborhood that I live in, almost, not all, but many of my immediate neighbors are either gay couples or just very progressive people in general, but it's definitely a mixed bag. So if you want to be around progressives, you're either going to have to find your small pocket, you're going to have to find your tribe, or just don't move here. So politics can be a little tricky, but if you're apolitical, then hey, no problem, right? All right, the next one on the list is going back to the concept of building. The ground here is challenging in Cochise County. It's either very sandy and it doesn't hold moisture and it's difficult to build on, or it's full of caliche, which is essentially calcified minerals that turn into an aggregate, a concrete, essentially. It's not crazy thick, but it can be everywhere, especially in my part of the county near the border. Caliche is everywhere. So anytime you need to dig a hole or make a trench or, do a footer for a building, you're going to be dealing with hard rock. And as someone who doesn't own a bulldozer or any heavy equipment, who has to do things with pickaxes, it can be challenging. In fact, I had to buy my first ever jackhammer off of Amazon. It was surprisingly cheap. It was only about 130 bucks and it works great. But it's a lot of work to use that jackhammer to break through the caliche to get a hole dug to create, to do fence posts or building posts, foundation work or whatever. So just be aware that you've got to pick your particular plot of land very carefully, and it can be a challenge in either direction. There is no just straight up dirt or ideal soil here like there is on farmland or in the Midwest or on the East Coast. It's pretty much challenging, either rocky or highly sandy conditions. So just something to be aware of. Again, if you're going to do an off-grid build, sometimes it's extra work. Reason number 4, I'm doing these in reverse order, and I'm saying 4. I actually started off with number 7 instead of 5. So I lied about the numbering. But the next one, number 4, is because we are up against the Mexico border, there are border crossers coming over the fence, the wall, whatever you want to call it. And as a result, Border Patrol is everywhere. Law enforcement is everywhere, especially on the highway that runs parallel, only about, 1 mile within sight of the border fence. The highway that goes by my land is parallel to the border wall. And of course, border crossers who do make it over the wall hit the highway and try to get out of Dodge and head towards, Phoenix and all points north. And that means Border Patrol is everywhere. So contrary to the rumors you hear about an open border, that is not true. The border is definitely closed in that sense. That's not to say it's not easy for people to get over the wall who are trying to come here to work, but it's a cat and mouse game with Border Patrol. So you've got to be used to, when you're traveling in the highway, there's not only is there Border Patrol, but there's lots of sheriffs and police trying to catch speeders, because oftentimes the people who are doing human smuggling and picking up border crossers and taking them to all points north, they speed. And so they are really cracking down on speeders. So you have to drive the speed limit. And if you're anti-law enforcement, this is probably not a place for you. Because again, it goes hand in hand with it being ruby red politically. Cochise County has a lot of people who are very pro-law enforcement, and there is a lot of law enforcement. Now, I tend to keep to myself, and again, being a middle ground guy, I sometimes have issues with law enforcement, but overall I'm damn glad they're here, because if there's something goes down and I need help, I do have self-defense weaponry to protect my land and my property and myself, and take care of any critters that may need to be taken care of, which I haven't had to do yet, thankfully. So I can defend myself, but if I need to, I'm going to call on law enforcement, and they're not very far away. Although if I need fire response, that's going to be 10 or 15 minutes out. It may not be super fast. But it's just something to be aware of, that when you're driving around, you do see and get passed by. I get passed all the time because I drive the speed limit. I get passed by multiple Border Patrol trucks. And when I head towards Sierra Vista, which is really the biggest town in all of Cochise County, there's speed traps and things like that. So it's just something to be aware of, that if you're anti-law enforcement, this may not be the place for you. And reason number 3, the jobs in the economy. I already mentioned about the employment and finding employees. But if you're wanting to move to Cochise County and you're going to be dependent on someone else to provide you employment, there's not a lot of options, because there's not a lot of industry here. There's certainly the trades that service, homeowners and things like that. There's obviously restaurants and retail, but there's not a lot of high-paying industry. There's, Fort Huachuca is a big army base that's not too far off, and that can provide some employment opportunities for civilians. There are, typical restaurant and tourism related industries. But if you want to make $100,000 a year plus and have a local job, there's not many of those jobs around unless you're a doctor or an attorney or in cybersecurity or something like that. So just something to be aware of. It's good to have a remote job or be self-employed if you plan on making a living here. You cannot bank on finding a good high-paying job. That's not to say it can't be done, but it may not just happen overnight. So that's something to plan for and to keep in mind, that the economy is relatively stable but slow, and people here aren't wealthy, and there's not a lot of manufacturing or industry to be found here. Mostly a lot of farming and agriculture and growing and things like that, but not high paying industries. It's just not here. So that's something to be aware of, and that might be a reason to keep you out of Cochise County. And then number 2, let's call this a bonus reason. The weather is harsh. I talked in the previous video that, Cochise County isn't nearly as hot as, some of the other counties like Maricopa County and in central Arizona where Phoenix is. However, the sun is somewhat relentless. It degrades things. The UV rays degrades things. There's often wind. And when we do get rains in the form of monsoons, which we're getting right now, they can cause some flash flooding. You can get 2 or 3 inches of rain in 1 hour out of nowhere, and you better be ready for it. So the weather is harsh. And the weather gives rise to cycles of nature where you can have a lot of insects. Suddenly there'll be moths or butterflies or dragonflies or mosquitoes everywhere for a solid month. It can be really feast or famine when it comes to insect swarms. So you got to be prepared for that. So sometimes it can feel like the weather is out to get you. The weather is trying to tear down anything you're trying to build. And if you're building alone or doing things alone like I am, and you only have 2 hands to hold things and the wind hits, it can be a challenge. So you have to get creative and find ways to keep things from blowing away. So the weather in the desert is extreme. It is sometimes feel like a battle. It can be a little bit discouraging sometimes. And it will break down your, plastic water tanks, plastic hoses, anything that you use for shade because of the wind might get ripped down. So shade structures can be a challenge to build. Just be aware that the weather is somewhat severe. Not all the time, but we definitely have our moments. And that can feel a bit like a battle. It can be a little bit discouraging sometimes. If you don't have, with the heat, you need really good air conditioning. You need really good shade. But of course, growing big shade trees is a challenge because it is the desert. So you only have a few options like desert willows or my brain's not working. I haven't had enough coffee. Pardon me. Let's take care of that right now. Take a break. The type of tree I couldn't think of was a Palo Verde tree. I've bought a couple of Palo Verdes. So trees, for shade can be a little challenging. They take years to grow. So just be aware the weather is harsh. And if you're going solar and you got solar arrays, they need to be anchored into the ground very well, or the wind can potentially blow them away during monsoon season. But as I mentioned, with the ground and the caliche that we have in the ground, it can be hard to dig footers and build things in order to anchor your solar panels, etc., etc. You get the idea. The weather can be harsh. And then last but not least, we'll call this reason number 7, or I'm sorry, my numbering is all jacked up. Wells or rainwater can be very location dependent, and that's generally true everywhere, but it's also true in Cochise County. We have vast portions of the east part of the county in the north where the water table is dropping rapidly due to over agriculture, too much cattle, too much pumping of groundwater. So even though Cochise County for thousands of years had stable groundwater in the water table, it's rapidly dropping. So digging a well may work, especially if you're closer to Bisbee, or Sierra Vista. That might work better than if you're way out near Wilcox or something like that. So whatever specific town you're considering perhaps moving to, you're going to want to do research on the water table. You're going to want to ask your neighbors, potential neighbors, you know, how deep they had to dig for their well, how much it cost them, what's the quality of the water. I personally am only doing rainwater catchment because in my part of the county, we get enough rain for that, and I've got enough roof surface. And being a single person who lives alone, I just don't use that much water. I don't even have a flushing toilet right now. So for 2 years, I've been doing my business in a camping toilet that I empty into my septic system every couple of weeks manually. Yeah, it's not ideal, and yes, when I build my main house, it's going to change. I will have a real toilet, and therefore my water usage will go up at that point. But I just don't use much, so I can get by with rainwater no problem. And a family of 2 or 3, if you're willing to invest in rainwater catchment tanks or cisterns, should be just fine. But if you're a family of 8, okay, you're going to go through a lot of water. You're going to be either need to be connected to city water, which is only maybe 5% of the county has city water. That's just a guess off the top of my head, maybe 10%. You're either going to have to plan for that, or you're going to have to dig a well, or you're going to have to do rainwater. But again, based on your location, just like with the soil conditions, either being real sandy or full of caliche, it's hit and miss with the water. So your location selection is very important, and you're going to want to do your research on where you intend to set up shop. So some of these reasons obviously apply to off-grid homesteader types. If you just want to buy a small house in the burbs or in the city, some of these things you're just not going to care about. What's under the ground you don't care about. Your water supply you may not care about. But there's no guarantee that all cities throughout Arizona are going to have endless, cheap water for the rest of time. Your water bills may go up. You might have water usage restrictions. Most places in Arizona, you can't have grass or lawns because they use too much water. So just be generally aware of, we've talked a lot about things like building codes, the ground, the soil, the weather, the water. These are sort of fundamental basics that a lot of people who grew up in the suburbs, they may not ever think about these types of issues or concerns. But, we're talking about the desert. You have to blend with your environment. You have to adapt to your environment. And so thinking through, the land and the conditions and the weather and things like that are pretty important. The other things like the economy and politics, well, I'd say those are concerns that are layered on top of, the harsh realities of the desert, and they're not as big a deal for some people. Like me being, remotely employed and working from here inside my tiny house, the overall state of the economy here is not going to be nearly as important for me. Also, I want to retire 7, 8, 10 years, somewhere in there. And at that point, the economy isn't as important either. Since I'm a DIYer, the lack of contractors isn't as big of a deal. So based on the feedback I'm giving you about Cochise County, you have to decide which of these, pros and cons are important for you. Yeah, some are going to be a big deal and some not at all. So with that, let me know what you're concerned about, what rumors you've heard. Going back to the border crossers and law enforcement being everywhere, I do get border crossers. They have come up to my house and asked for water and help in directions. I've also seen the human traffickers driving by, and I call that in. You have to decide which of these things are important to you, but don't get the impression that, we are overrun by border crossers. It's not like that. I see them on occasion walking down the highway or crossing my land, but it's not rampant. It's not a swarm. It's not, and they are just trying to get away from the area. They're not committing crimes or other than maybe borrowing, some drinking water so they don't die. They're just trying to get the hell out of here and away from Border Patrol and go to a big city where they can find employment. So you don't really have issues with violence or theft or vandalism or anything like that from border crossers. So don't buy into the propaganda that the U.S. border is overrun by, Mexicans or South Americans or Central Americans trying to find work here. Yes, they're coming across, but it doesn't generally create a problem in my day-to-day life, even though I'm right at the border and they do cross my land. So don't buy into the propaganda about that topic. So let me know what your concerns are. If I get enough questions or comments, which it's not likely, but if I get enough and I see some patterns there, I'm happy to shoot another video that does address your concerns. So let me know what you think of the video. Let me know if any of these were unexpected for you or if you heard them all elsewhere. Just trying to be helpful and share my experience building off-grid in Cochise County, because it is a great place, but it's got its challenges too, and it's like every place, pros and cons, right? All right, thanks for watching. I look forward to hearing from you. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.